And welcome back again. This session, we get to take a look at Devarim. Begins, Ele HaDevarim Asher Diber Moshe El Kol Yisrael. And these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel. Or you could call it Deuteronomium, as the Vulgate does. Deuteronomy. Well, what were your impressions when you read the book of Deuteronomy? How does the book develop the concept of the people of God? Now, Deuteronomy doesn't just come out of a hat. It's set in a context. In one respect, the context is the end of the 40 years of wandering through the Sinai Peninsula and then eking out a living in the area of Kadesh Barnea in the wilderness of Zin. But in another respect, its context is the mid-second millennium BC in the ancient Near East. And the interesting thing about this is that over the last 150 years or so, whole libraries have been discovered that shed light on the region in this particular period. For example, second millennium Hittite treaties between the suzerain, the great king, and the vassals, the subservient kings, have been discovered. And we've learned something about the genre of these treaty covenants. There seems to be a standard form for these treaty covenants. They begin with a preamble, and then there's a historical prologue, and then we get down to business with the stipulations. Then there's provision to ratify this covenant with blessings and cursings. And then it ends up with succession provisions. So, for example, the treaty between Marcellus, late 17th century, early 16th century, Marcellus, the great king, and Dupiteseb of Amuru. There are a number of other examples, but that's one. And it's fascinating to see that as Moses prepares to pass the baton and get the faith community ready to settle into God's rest, he seems to take up the treaty genre. And it looks awfully like, for example, you've got a preamble in Deuteronomy 1:1-5. And then beginning with verse 6, you get into the prologue. Chapter 4, you begin a section on stipulations, 4-11. And then beginning with chapter 12, the ratification. And then as we get on to toward the end of that, 12-26, and then 27-30, the blessings and the cursings. And then succession plans, 31-34. Well, while the Vulgate names the book the second law, Deuteronomium, actually they're stealing from Greek, nomos, law. Actually, it's more a treaty than it is a law code. But at the same time, Deuteronomy is far more expansive than any Hittite or Assyrian treaty uncovered so far. I mean, it includes a lot of details that just are not in those other treaties. So, for example, in 12-36, extended instructions, or the itineraries in chapter 2, or the poetry in chapters 32 and 33, the moral instructions that we find in Deuteronomy that we don't find in the other texts. But there is evidence that Deuteronomy is at least influenced by the genre. Well, speaking of genre, actually, Deuteronomy presents itself as a collection of discourses or speeches by Moses with the faith community on the brink of entering the promised land. A key verse I'd like to suggest to you is found in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12-13. Deuteronomy 10, 12-13. And now, O Israel, What does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you this day for your good. Well, what's going on here? Does this sound like some sort of a legalistic text? I don't think so. I don't think at all that that's what's happening. This is for their well-being. I love Gordon McConville's take on Deuteronomy. He writes, "The Torah, therefore, to anticipate, is a word of grace, as was the creative word itself. It's given to a people, brought from slavery, led through the wilderness, as they stand on the brink of entering their land, a new sphere of freedom in service of Yahweh. It's a word of blessing and life, a word that creates the community of faith." So, this is not the letter that kills. That's a misunderstanding of Torah. We're concerned instead with the word of the Lord, living and making alive in the community that he has made his own. Well, we thought a bit about these instructions, not as in order to rules, but as expressions of God's righteous expectations because of what he's already done for us. And far from calling for a legalistic response in the First Testament or the next, the obedience of faith is the hallmark of a believer. Remember over in the other Testament, there's an account of a seminary spiritual formation class. It's in Luke 6. The prophet's taking his students off on a retreat. Let me cut to the chase. In Luke 4:46, Jesus asks, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and you do not do what I tell you?" So you see some continuity there. Let me review just a moment some of the things that we have talked about already. Remember back when I suggested how foundational Genesis was to the Torah, and it's addressing worldview issues, beginning to teach the promise, then how Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers provide the essential framework for this covenant and its attendant relationship, and all that was headed somewhere to Deuteronomy. And now Deuteronomy is the focal point of the Pentateuch in many ways. Exodus through Numbers provides the essential framework for the covenant ratification. So we saw the emphasis on redemption in Exodus 1 through 19, worship and social organization, Exodus 20 through Numbers 10, followed by the narrative of the trip, Numbers 10 through 21, recounting Israel's failure and God's chastisement. This is the framework of Moses' approach now to this generation, entering into the promised land. They're on the Transjordanian plateau. That's being conquered under Moses and spoken for by Reuben, Gad, half-tribe of Manasseh, providing them tangible evidence of this Emmanuel theology. I am with you. And that provides grounds for the people to respond to Moses as he sketches the house of the covenant. Genesis provides the footing on which the framework is built. And what Moses tells Israel is an outcome of God's relationship of grace with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, turned Israel. You know, even freedom from bondage is based on the promise. So we saw how Genesis 1 through 11 is preface to 12 through 50 and essential to a clear understanding of the good news of the promise. There had been the judgment of the flood. They were singled out by grace. A single person would be the father of a nation through whom the whole world would receive God's blessing. So, If you had to boil down the message of Deuteronomy in one sentence, and that'd be a tall order for 34 chapters, but how would you express it? Can I suggest that the message of Deuteronomy is one of love and grace that calls for mutual love and trust, which is expressed in obedience. So once again, in terms of structure, we got the preamble, chapter 1, verse 1 through 5. They're 40 years into an 11-day trip. And Moses expounds God's instructions, the Torah, to all Israel. And you may ask, why did an 11-day trip take 40 years? Well, both the Torah and the New Testament single out the cause. Talked about it in Numbers. It was unbelief. Then we come to verse 6, and then chapter 2, chapter 3, the historical prologue. We've got the crisis at Kadesh, and the amazing story of this heroic, minuscule minority of just 2 who followed the Lord fully. Love that line. And then there's a parenthesis in the travelogue in chapter 1, verse 9 through 18. It points to the Torah as the successor of Moses. Torah is transcendent, and leadership is to be more diffuse in the next generation. No one is above Torah. Well, then we get introduced to some family dynamics in chapter 2. Edom, related to whom? Esau. And Moab, another cousin. What's the connection there? Lot. And then there's also the Amorites as well that are involved in some of the tensions in chapter 2. By Moses' time, the Amorite kings ruled most of Transjordan, and they were also a bit in Cisjordan. We find them at Ai and Jebus and Hebron and Lachish and Eglon, but more about that later. You see, wisdom comes not from mere knowing, but from the practice of truth. And so Moses challenges his people to practice, to apply the revelation that they had received from God in the wilderness now to a new situation. They're going to have to recontextualize it. This new situation that they're facing in the promised land. In the wilderness, when they doubted God, when they had little and they wanted to go back, well, that was then. Now, as they enter this land, it's described as a land flowing with milk and honey. And they'll be tempted to doubt God again, but not because of lack, but because of plenty. Stipulations, I mentioned, chapters 4 through 26. You got the basic stipulations in 4 through 11. So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is wise and understanding. The punchline of this whole section of teaching is, don't forget his dealings and his promise, and be faithful to make disciples of the next generation. As we'll see, we're always only one generation away from paganism. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 40, this call to obedience. Watch now, it's God who is speaking. It's God who blesses obedience and is grieved by disobedience. It's God who is concerned about the witness to the Gentiles in chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, passage we just read. God's revelation is no light matter, and obedience of faith is the only appropriate response to God's love and grace. Pay close attention to chapter 4, verse 37. Because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose their descendants after them, and he personally brought you from Egypt by his great power. Well, no wonder when Jesus comes along, he says, don't get the idea that I came to abolish, but rather to fill full. And by the way, woe to anyone who messes with these instructions. Or later, he chides Peter for lacking understanding. He pushes back against the enemy with the Tanakh, specifically citing from Deuteronomy, it is written, it is written, it is written. Paul is still teaching Torah to Christians at Rome in Romans chapter 13, verse 9. And this should be no big surprise. He'd already staked out his take on the First Testament in Romans 7:12 when he said, so then, the Torah is holy. The commandment is holy and righteous and good. Well, we see also in Deuteronomy a call to make disciples. Look at Deuteronomy 4:9. Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Then here, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons, to your children and to your children's children. Or look at verse 40. So you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I'm giving you today, that it may be well with you and your children after you, that you may live long on the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time. Get it? I need to live in such a way so that they might know and do the will of God. It's this whole idea of reverence and respect, the fear of the Lord, a holy fear, a reverence of God's holiness and authority. Well, in light of what we've briefly alluded to in the life and teaching of Jesus, can you see this being lived out? I mean, Jesus' life and work was characterized by obedience to God even when he didn't want to. It was characterized by submission to his word even when it might not be convenient or culturally popular. Think about that. And we'll see you in a bit.